Nostalgia is a very powerful thing, which is no surprise why the Callisto Protocol has been poorly received compared to its spiritual predecessor, Dead Space. Despite sharing many characteristics, a lot of people haven't been so kind towards the game's new take on the survival horror genre. I do not understand why people were willing to ignore some of the quote problems in Dead Space, but overlook the ways that the Callisto Protocol improved on the formula. I say problems in quotations because I don't see them as issues, but rather design choices, but that's something that will be discussed later. In this review, I will break down the areas of criticism I have seen towards the game and address why I disagree with the takes I have seen. The categories we will be discussing are gameplay, level design, scare factor, and story. Keep in mind, this is the review of the game in the year of our Lord, January 20th, 2023. So many of the issues present at launch, including the combat when dealing with multiple enemies, have been patched. Let's start with the gameplay. If you go into the Callisto Protocol expecting to get early access to the Dead Space remake, look elsewhere. Because although there are many similarities between the two, this game has its own take on how it handles combat. This is something I thought improved on the original Dead Space formula. The Callisto Protocol mixes up the gameplay between melee, shooting, and stealth. The latter two styles of gameplay don't become more prominent until around 2 to 3 hours in, but with the free edition of New Game Plus, this game truly makes you approach every situation however you see fit. You can even find schematics for the skunk shotgun early in the game if exploration is your jam. The melee combat works well. You move right or left before an enemy attacks, and then you either pull off a quick or long attack with the chance they may counterattack prior to you making your move. On day one, there were issues with fighting multiple enemies and getting hit even when dodging, but those have been addressed in the latest patches. Not that the games should be released in this state, but oh well, it's 2023, this is just the absolute state of gaming. The next thing I want to discuss is the level design. The level design is another area of criticism I have seen brought up about this game. The critics have said that this game is, quote, too linear in comparison to Dead Space. There are two things I want to address about this criticism. Number one, it's no more linear and only slightly less open-ended than the original Dead Space, if that even makes sense. Probably doesn't, but it's best comparison I could make. Although Dead Space had some open-ended areas, they were mostly there to give resources when you were running low on health and ammo, or as an occasional side objective or sub-objective. Better to say it that way. The Callisto Protocol doesn't have side quests per se, but will reward you handsomely for going off the well-worn path. This is coming from somebody who has played all of the Dead Space games and has completed Callisto Protocol from start to finish. The second thing I want to address is that linear game design isn't a good or bad thing. It's just that, a design choice. Not every game needs to be an open-ended game. If you want an open-ended survival horror game, I would simply just wait for the Resident Evil 4 remake on March 23rd, 2023. God willing, it isn't delayed. In addition to this, the game doesn't have a navigation system, which some have criticized. Pick a side. Either the game is too linear and holds your hand too much, or it's too hard and forces you to be aware of your surroundings. The third thing I want to discuss is the scare factor. The third area of criticism I've seen is that the game isn't as scary as Dead Space. My first reply to that is if you play nothing but survival horror games, then you'd be hard-pressed to be scared by any new game. It's just something that comes with being a survival horror fanatic. You eventually become desensitized to it. Furthermore, considering that the game sold approximately 3.6 million units less than expected, and the fact that barely anybody can afford a dozen eggs at the grocery store under the Brandon economy, I doubt that most of the people in the YouTube comments parroting the, quote, Callisto bad opinion actually played the game. I know that opinion was a little bit of a hot take, but if you've been around my channel for long enough, I think you would know my opinions by now. Black Iron Prison has an extremely oppressive atmosphere, and while it didn't scare me early on in the game, the second half of the game was downright disturbing at times, and was on par to what Dead Space offered. I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian here, but close quarters combat doesn't make the game any less scary. And in addition to this, on a side rant, some people have criticized the way that you have to replenish your health. Yes, at launch, it took around 5 to 8 seconds from what I heard. I forget whether it was 5 or 8 seconds, but they've reduced that time to 3 seconds. When you have to stay motionless for 3 seconds to replenish your health, the scare factor comes into play when you realize you can't just heal mid-combat, so every scenario you encounter requires caution. The last criticism I want to address is the story, which, you guessed it, has been criticized for being less influenced by H.P. Lovecraft and taking a direction akin to Resident Evil. If you want to play tit for tat, however, the story was told in a much better format than Dead Space. Though the cutscenes are unskippable, you don't want to skip them. You care about the characters and the world that surrounds you. There is more revealed in the 11 hours of the Callisto Protocol than there was revealed in Dead Space 1 and 2. If you want to criticize the length of the game, I looked it up and Dead Space takes approximately 11 hours to beat as well, so your nostalgia is getting in the way of your logic here. Overall, the Callisto Protocol is a very good entry into the survival horror genre. It takes what players are familiar with in other games such as Dead Space and Resident Evil, and adds its own unique take. Is it the greatest survival horror game ever made? No, it isn't, but it doesn't need to be. I've been saying for a while, many of the groundbreaking ideas for video games were reached during the latter half of the 7th generation console period, and it won't be a while until we come across something that truly reinvents the wheel. I highly recommend you give this game a chance, especially with the DLC coming out here real soon. If you haven't played this yet, or if you are playing and struggling to continue because of how boring the tutorial is, my advice to you is stick with it. I promise the game gets better about 2 to 3 hours in. I give this game an 8 out of 10.